betrayed and broken, a husband's ultimate revenge. The late summer sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the college campus. Mark Porter gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly as he pulled into the crowded parking lot, the air inside the car thick with unspoken emotions. In the passenger seat, his wife, Amanda, adjusted her sunglasses, her face unreadable. Their youngest son, Ryan, sat in the back, restless with excitement, his fingers drumming against his knee. Mark had expected this day to feel bittersweet, a mix of pride and sorrow as they left their last child to begin his journey into adulthood. But beneath the expected parental nostalgia, something else simmered, something dark, something unresolved. He wasn't just sending his son off to college today. He was taking the first step toward the destruction of a life he had carefully built. The SUV rumbled to a stop in front of Ryan's dorm. Freshmen in college-branded hoodies hurried past, some dragging overstuffed suitcases, others carrying plastic bins filled with remnants of their childhood bedrooms. Mark took a deep breath. "All right," he said, forcing a smile as he turned to Ryan. "Let's get you moved in." Ryan was already halfway out of the car, eager to embrace his newfound independence. Amanda chuckled, shaking her head as she stepped out to help. Her long auburn hair caught the sunlight, and for a moment, Mark felt a familiar pang of admiration. Then it was gone, snuffed out by the truth he could no longer ignore. They carried box after box up to the small, neatly arranged dorm room. Ryan's roommate, a lanky kid named Dylan, greeted them with a casual nod before continuing to set up his gaming console. Posters of rock bands and sci-fi movies lined the walls, a clear contrast to Ryan's neatly folded clothes and untouched textbooks. "Looks like you'll fit right in," Amanda said, nudging Ryan playfully. Ryan smirked. "Yeah, I think I'll survive." Mark stood back, watching them, watching her. There was a time when moments like these had felt perfect, when he believed in the life they had built, in the love they had shared. But today, it felt like a well-rehearsed performance, one he was no longer willing to be a part of. After a few more goodbyes and reminders to call home, they made their way back to the car. The drive home was quiet, a stark contrast to the lively chatter of the morning. Ryan was gone. The house would be empty. And now, there was nothing left to distract Mark from what he knew. As they pulled into their driveway, their longtime neighbor, Katie, waved from across the street. "Empty nesters now." "Huh?" she called out, a teasing lilt in her voice. Amanda laughed, stepping out of the car. "Looks like it. Now we get to figure out what to do with all this free time." Mark forced a chuckle, but inside his mind was elsewhere. A decade-old truth was about to resurface. A storm was coming, and Amanda had no idea. He glanced at the mailbox before heading inside. If he had known what awaited him within that small metal box, if he had known how that simple act of retrieving the mail would shatter the last remnants of his illusions, he might have hesitated. But he didn't. And with that, the past came roaring back. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Mark stood by the kitchen counter, flipping absently through the day's mail, credit card offers, a couple of bills, a grocery store flyer. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, his fingers brushed against something different. A thick, padded envelope. No return address. Mark's brow furrowed as he turned it over in his hands. The packaging was worn, the edges slightly frayed as if it had passed through too many hands before finally reaching his doorstep. There was no postage, no signs of its origin, meaning someone had hand-delivered it. A strange feeling crept into his stomach, an instinctive unease. He wasn't sure why, but something about it felt wrong. With deliberate caution, he peeled away the seal and reached inside. His fingers brushed against something smooth, paper, thick and slightly glossy. He pulled it out. Inside was a smaller manila envelope, sealed shut. Written in neat, precise handwriting on the front was a single word. "Amanda." Mark's heartbeat stuttered. A rush of thoughts flooded his mind. Was it from a friend? A secret admirer? A debt collector? No, none of those made sense. His wife wasn't the type to keep secrets, was she? He ran a hand over his mouth, debating whether to open it. It was addressed to Amanda, not him. But something inside him, a dark whisper of suspicion, told him that whatever was in this envelope was meant to stay hidden. He tore it open. A letter slid out, folded neatly, along with something heavier. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper and began to read. Amanda, it's been years, but I still think about you. About us. I can't believe how quickly time passed, how we lost touch. I always told you I'd keep our little secret safe. And I have. Until now. The truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it? Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's nostalgia, or maybe I just wanted you to remember what we had. Either way, I thought it was time you saw these again. Consider it a gift, a keepsake from our time together. Josh. Josh. Mark felt a jolt, like an electric shock to his system. His grip on the letter tightened. Josh had been their neighbor years ago, before he and Amanda had moved to their new house. A man Mark had never really liked. A man he had long suspected of being too friendly with Amanda, but had dismissed as paranoid jealousy. His pulse thundered as he turned his attention to the rest of the envelope's contents. Photographs. The first was of Amanda, young, beautiful, dressed in a tight black dress he barely remembered. She was smiling, but not at the camera, at someone just outside the frame. His breathing quickened as he flipped to the next photo. Amanda, in lingerie. Then another, Amanda, completely naked, lying on a bed he didn't recognize. Mark felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His stomach churned, and a cold sweat formed at the back of his neck. But he wasn't done. His fingers, now trembling, reached for the last few photos. Amanda, with Josh. The images left no room for doubt. His wife, writhing beneath another man, her face twisted in pleasure. The timestamp in the corner told him everything he needed to know. These weren't recent. They were from 10 years ago. A time when he and Amanda had still been deeply in love. A time when their firstborn had barely been a year old. A time when Mark had thought their marriage was solid, unshakable. How wrong he had been. He couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with something suffocating. He felt sick. Why now? Why, after all these years, had Josh decided to send this? Revenge? Spite? Or was there something more? Mark's grip tightened on the photos until his knuckles turned white. He had two choices: pretend he never saw them and go on living a lie, or confront Amanda and uncover the rest of the truth. His jaw clenched. He already knew what he was going to do, and Amanda had no idea what was coming. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Mark sat at his desk, his hands shaking as he held the glossy, damning photographs from the envelope. Amanda's face, younger but unmistakable, stared back at him from the images, eyes half-lidded in pleasure, mouth open in ecstasy, her body tangled with Josh's. Mark felt like he was suffocating. The air in his home, his sanctuary, felt poisoned. The woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted with his children, had been unfaithful while he was working long hours to provide for their family. The betrayal was a knife in his gut, but another thought crept into his mind like a slow-moving shadow, whispering doubts he could no longer ignore. Their younger son. A strange, gnawing fear settled in his bones. He had dismissed it before, shoved it into the darkest corners of his mind, every time someone mentioned how the boy didn't quite look like him. He had blamed it on genetics, on distant relatives, on random chance. But now, with these photos proving Amanda's affair had been ongoing around the time of their son's birth, the doubt clawed its way to the surface. He pushed himself away from the desk and strode to the closet. His hands trembled as he pulled out an old, dust-covered box filled with paperwork. He dug through the folders, tossing aside tax documents, mortgage papers, and medical records until he found what he was looking for: his children's birth records. Mark sat down and spread the documents on the table, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He read over his younger son's file, the words blurring before his eyes. And then he saw it. Blood type, A positive. A sharp chill ran through his spine. He forced himself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe there was some rare genetic anomaly that could explain it. He needed to check his own records, Amanda's too. With a sense of dread settling over him like a storm cloud, he flipped through his own medical documents. Blood type, O negative. Mark clenched his jaw. His eyes darted to Amanda's records. Blood type, O positive. A deep, suffocating silence filled the room. His vision darkened at the edges as a terrible realization took hold, sinking its claws into his mind. It was impossible for two parents with type O blood to produce a child with type A blood. The papers slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. His younger son, the boy he had raised, taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, comforted through fevers and nightmares, was not his. Mark's breath hitched, and for the first time in years, he felt a tear slip down his cheek. His world, already fractured, had just been completely obliterated. The room around him felt foreign now, as if he were trapped inside a stranger's house. The wedding photos on the wall mocked him. The furniture he had chosen with Amanda felt tainted. The very air he breathed felt laced with betrayal. He wanted to scream, to break something, to storm into the bedroom and drag Amanda out of bed and demand the truth. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there, his body motionless while his mind burned with 1,000 thoughts. Had Amanda always known? Did she suspect? Or worse, did she always know and just never care? Mark's hands curled into fists. His nails dug into his palms, grounding him in the cold, cruel reality of it all. He had to be smart. If he confronted her now, she would lie, twist the truth, manipulate the situation. He needed more. He needed proof. A slow, calculating calm washed over him. He would get a DNA test, quietly, carefully, and once he had the undeniable truth in his hands, Amanda would have no place to hide. Mark exhaled, long and slow, steadying himself. He was no longer just a betrayed husband. He was a man on a mission. The morning light slanted through the kitchen window, glinting off Amanda's wedding ring as she poured coffee into her favorite mug. The sight of it, of her wearing that ring like it still meant something, made Mark's stomach churn. The betrayal sat in his chest like a lump of hot coal, burning away at the love he had once held for her. Amanda hummed softly as she leaned against the counter, flipping through her phone. She looked serene, oblivious. How many times had he sat at this very table, believing in the lie they had built together? How many mornings had he kissed her, told her he loved her, never knowing what she had done? Mark took a slow sip of his coffee, his fingers tightening around the ceramic handle. He needed to know. He needed to see it in her face. "Hey," he said casually, setting his mug down. "You remember Josh?" The reaction was immediate. The way her body stiffened, just for a second, a barely noticeable hitch in her breath, was all the confirmation Mark needed. "Josh," Amanda repeated, glancing up. Her voice was light, but the hesitation behind it was unmistakable. "Our old neighbor?" "Of course. Why?" Mark swirled the coffee in his cup, watching the dark liquid circle like the storm brewing inside him. "I was just thinking about old times," he said smoothly. "I mean, we lived next door to him for years. Kind of weird how we just lost touch, right?" Amanda shrugged, setting her phone down. "Not really. He was always a bit of a mess. Remember how he used to get drunk and ramble about his photography?" She laughed, but it was forced. "I'm sure he moved on, probably still taking terrible pictures somewhere." Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Funny thing, though," he mused. "I got something in the mail yesterday. From him." Amanda blinked. "Josh sent you something?" "Well, not exactly. It was addressed to you." For the first time, a flicker of something dark passed through her eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by feigned curiosity, but Mark had seen it. A moment of panic, of realization. "Oh," Amanda said, tilting her head. "That's weird. What was it?" Mark let the silence stretch between them, watching her squirm. He could see the gears turning in her mind, calculating, scrambling. "A letter," he said finally, his voice even. "And photos." Amanda's fingers tightened around her coffee mug, knuckles turning white. Photos. Yeah, Mark nodded, taking another sip of coffee as if discussing the weather. Of you. The color drained from her face. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Tell me, Amanda, were you ever going to tell me? Amanda swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she set her coffee down on the counter. Mark, she started, but there was no conviction in her voice, only fear. Don't, Mark cut in sharply. Don't insult me with lies. I want the truth. Her breathing was uneven now, her chest rising and falling with short, shallow breaths. It was a long time ago, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It didn't mean anything. Mark let out a cold, humorless laugh. Didn't mean anything? He shook his head, feeling the weight of every year he had spent loving her. Every year spent living a lie. Amanda, you had an affair. You fucked him while our son was a baby in the next room. Tears welled in her eyes, but Mark felt nothing. No sympathy, no sadness, just a hollow, burning rage. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, reaching for his hand. Mark pulled away so fast that her fingers barely brushed his skin. But you did, he said, his voice steel. And the worst part? You let me love a child that might not even be mine. Amanda let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth with her hands. But Mark didn't care. He had seen enough. The illusion was shattered. The woman he thought he knew was nothing more than a stranger, and the life they had built together was nothing but a lie. And for the first time in years, Mark saw his path clearly. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was war. Mark sat in his car outside his brother Eric's law firm, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded in his chest, not from nerves but from rage. The kind of rage that simmers beneath the surface, boiling slowly until it overflows and consumes everything in its path. He took a deep breath and glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face looked older, harsher. His eyes, once filled with warmth, now held only bitterness and cold calculation. He had spent the last 24 hours replaying the betrayal over and over in his head, the weight of Amanda's deceit pressing down on him like an iron fist. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the years of lies, the false intimacy, the stolen moments that had been nothing but a facade. It was about the fact that he had unknowingly raised another man's child as his own. Mark exhaled sharply and stepped out of the car, the chill of the autumn air cutting through his jacket. He crossed the busy street and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the firm, the scent of polished wood and expensive cologne filling his nostrils. Mr. Holloway, the receptionist, greeted him with a forced smile. Eric is expecting you. You can go right in. Mark nodded, barely acknowledging her, and made his way down the long corridor to his brother's office. He didn't bother knocking. He simply pushed open the door and stepped inside. Eric looked up from his desk, his brows furrowing in concern. Unlike Mark, Eric had always been the composed one, the one who thrived in structure, logic, and control. His office reflected that: sleek black furniture, meticulously arranged case files, and a collection of law books that lined the walls like silent sentinels of justice. Mark wasted no time. He threw the manila envelope onto Eric's desk. Open it, he said, his voice a low growl. Eric hesitated, then reached for the envelope. The moment he pulled out the photographs, his expression shifted from confusion to shock. He flipped through them, his jaw tightening with each new image. Jesus Christ, he muttered, setting the photos down as though they burned his fingers. He looked up at Mark. Is this real? Mark let out a humorless laugh. Oh, it's real. Every single disgusting frame. Eric ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, exhaling sharply. How long have you known? Since yesterday. Eric's eyes widened. And you didn't go straight to Amanda? Mark shook his head. Not yet. I wanted to come to you first. I need to know what my options are. I need to know how to destroy her. Eric sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Look, Mark, I get that you're angry. Angry? Mark cut him off, his voice rising. I'm beyond angry. She's been lying to me for over a decade, Eric. She made me believe our marriage was real while she was screwing our drunk-ass neighbor behind my back. Eric held up a hand. I hear you. But if you go into this blind, if you let your emotions control you, you're going to lose. You want justice? Then we do this the smart way. Mark clenched his jaw. Then tell me how. Eric leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. First things first, divorce. But this isn't just a simple case of infidelity, Mark. If you try to use this against her in court, you need undeniable proof, not just some old photos. Mark gestured to the envelope. Isn't this proof enough? Eric shook his head. Legally? Not really. These are old. A judge could argue that whatever happened is in the past, that you forgave her by staying. What you need is something current, something that proves her unfaithfulness is still ongoing. Mark's stomach twisted. The idea of Amanda still being involved with Josh made his blood boil, but deep down, he knew Eric was right. And the kid? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric's face darkened. That's where things get messy. If he's not biologically yours, you have a case to challenge paternity. But even if you prove he's Josh's, the law doesn't care about biology as much as you think. If you raised him as your own, the court may still hold you responsible for child support. Mark's fingers curled into fists. So what? I'm just supposed to keep paying for another man's child? Eric hesitated before answering. Not necessarily, but we need to play this strategically. If you accuse Amanda outright, she'll fight back. And if this turns into a war, the legal fees alone will bleed you dry. Mark exhaled sharply, staring at his brother. So what do I do? Eric sighed. You gather evidence. You stay calm. And when the time is right, you make your move. Mark nodded slowly, the rage in his chest shifting into something else, something colder. He had wanted immediate revenge, but Eric was right. This wasn't about satisfying his anger. This was about making Amanda pay in a way she would never recover from. And he would make damn sure she did. Mark stepped into the dimly lit office of Richard Big Shot Caldwell, one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state. The man had a reputation for being ruthless. Some whispered that he could strip a woman of her last dime without breaking a sweat, while others swore he could make a cheating spouse regret they were ever born. The office was designed to intimidate. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with law books that looked more like weapons than legal texts. A massive desk sat at the center of the room, as imposing as the man behind it. Caldwell leaned back in a black leather chair, his suit crisp, his gaze unreadable. Mark had expected arrogance, maybe even a smirk, but Caldwell simply studied him with cold efficiency. He steepled his fingers and said, Eric tells me you've got a hell of a case on your hands. Mark swallowed hard, then nodded. I just want justice. Caldwell let out a humorless chuckle. Justice? You mean revenge? Mark tensed, his jaw clenching. I want what's fair. Caldwell leaned forward, his eyes gleaming like a predator catching the scent of blood. Fair? You've been married over 20 years. You have 2 kids, he paused. Well, 1.5, let's say. The courts don't give a damn about fair. They care about precedent, about stability. And right now, your wife? She's the one with stability. You're an angry husband with a DNA test and a broken heart. Mark exhaled sharply. So what do I do? Caldwell picked up a gold pen and tapped it against the desk. First off, you don't go nuclear, at least not yet. You want to expose her? Drag her through the mud? That's satisfying for about 5 minutes. But what happens next? She plays the victim. The court sees you as the bitter ex-husband trying to punish her. And suddenly, you're not the wrong party anymore. You're just the aggressive one. Mark clenched his fists. She lied to me for over a decade. I raised a kid that wasn't mine. Caldwell nodded. And that sucks. But here's the part that'll really piss you off. In the eyes of the law, that kid, he's yours. You've raised him. You've loved him. You've provided for him. And guess what? That means if you challenge paternity, you might still have to pay child support. Mark's stomach turned. That's insane. Caldwell shrugged. It's the law. Silence stretched between them. Mark's mind was spinning, rage simmering beneath his skin. Then what the hell are my options? Caldwell leaned back again, studying him. You play the long game. You start by securing financial control. Separate accounts. Document everything. Stop making any unnecessary payments that could be seen as gifts. Trust me, the court loves to twist that into alimony later. Mark nodded, absorbing every word. Next, Caldwell continued. You gather more dirt. You got photos? Good. You got the PI's report? Even better. But you need more. Emotional distress, hidden assets, secret rendezvous. Anything that can make her look unstable. You want to be the parent who provides stability. That's how you win custody. Mark narrowed his eyes. And if I want her to suffer? Caldwell smiled for the first time, a slow, predatory grin. Then we bleed her dry, quietly. Mark exhaled, his anger sharpening into something colder. Tell me how. Caldwell opened a drawer and slid a sleek folder across the desk. Welcome to the art of war, Mr. Reeves. And just like that, Mark's quest for justice turned into something far more dangerous. Mark sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The world outside his windshield blurred as his mind churned with the weight of his discoveries. The DNA test, the photographs, the betrayal. And yet, there was still more to uncover, more filth buried beneath the perfect illusion of his marriage. With a deep breath, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small business card, its edges worn from where his fingers had traced over the embossed print repeatedly. Vincent Kane, private investigator. Kane's reputation was notorious, discreet, thorough, and relentless. He was the kind of man who found skeletons even when people thought they had buried them in concrete. Mark exhaled slowly and dialed the number. The dimly lit office smelled like stale coffee and cigarette smoke. A ceiling fan creaked as it lazily spun overhead, doing little to alleviate the suffocating warmth of the room. Vincent Kane sat behind a cluttered desk, his sharp blue eyes scanning Mark as if peeling away his skin to see the secrets beneath. So, you want me to dig up dirt on your wife? Kane leaned back in his chair, exuding the confidence of a man who had seen 1,000 cases just like this. Mark hesitated before answering. Not just dirt. I need the truth, every ugly piece of it. Kane smirked, lighting a cigarette. The truth ain't always pretty, pal. You sure you're ready for it? Mark met his gaze. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. Kane studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll need addresses, names, any suspicions you already have. If there's something to find, I'll find it. Mark handed over the manila envelope, the same one that had shattered his world. Kane flipped through the photos, his expression unreadable. Sloppy work, he muttered. Your wife's boyfriend wasn't careful. I can already tell you, there's more where this came from. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure if he could handle more. Days passed like a slow-moving nightmare. Mark barely slept, his mind oscillating between anger and anticipation. He threw himself into work, pretending to function, but in reality, he was just waiting for the call, for the verdict for whatever Poison Kane would unearth. Finally, it came. Meet me at the docks. Midnight. You want to see this in person. Kane's voice was clipped, businesslike. Mark's pulse quickened as he drove through the deserted streets, his headlights cutting through the dense fog rolling in from the bay. When he arrived, Kane was already waiting, standing beneath a flickering streetlight with a folder tucked under his arm. Hope you're not the type to get sentimental, Kane said, handing over the folder. Turns out, your wife wasn't just screwing around with Josh. She had someone covering for her. Mark's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough to recognize faces. Katie, his neighbor, his wife's best friend. In one set of photos, Amanda could be seen sneaking out of Josh's house in the dead of night, and in another, Katie stood outside, scanning the street like a sentry before giving Amanda the all-clear. Mark's stomach lurched. The betrayal ran deeper than he thought. Kane exhaled a cloud of smoke. Your wife wasn't just a cheater, she had an alibi provider. Someone to cover for her when you got suspicious. Katie's been playing both sides for years. Mark clenched his jaw, his fingernails digging into his palms. That bitch, he growled. That's not all, Kane said, flipping to another page. I checked Josh's financial records. Looks like Amanda wired him money about a year ago, an amount that lines up suspiciously well with a hush payment. Mark felt like he'd been punched in the gut. His wife had paid off the man who had fathered her child. You wanted to keep digging? Kane asked, studying Mark carefully. Mark swallowed hard. He had enough evidence to ruin Amanda, to destroy the fantasy life she had built on deceit. But part of him wanted to see just how deep the rot went. He took one last look at the incriminating photos before closing the folder. Dig, he said, his voice ice cold. I want everything. Mark sat in his car outside his childhood home, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension. The house looked exactly the same. The neatly trimmed hedges, the porch light that always flickered at dusk, the wind chime that tinkled with every passing breeze. It was a symbol of stability, of childhood memories untouched by the corrosion of time. But tonight, it felt foreign, like an artifact from a life that no longer belonged to him. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here for answers. With a deep breath, he stepped out, his dress shoes crunching against the gravel of the driveway. His mother's house had always been a sanctuary, a place where problems shrank under the warm glow of home-cooked meals and motherly wisdom. But as he walked up the steps and rang the doorbell, he knew this visit would not be about comfort. It would be about the hard truths he had spent a decade ignoring. The door opened, and there she was. Ellen Reeves, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair neatly pulled back into a bun. Her sharp blue eyes, the same color as Mark's, studied him with quiet concern. Mark? What's wrong? He swallowed the lump in his throat and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. I need to talk, he said, his voice tight. She led him to the kitchen, where a pot of tea was already steeping. She always seemed to know when he needed her. It used to make him feel safe. Now, he wondered if it had made him blind. They sat across from each other at the old wooden table, the same one where Mark had done his homework as a boy, where his father had read the newspaper every morning, where countless family dinners had been shared. He placed the manila envelope on the table between them. His mother's eyes flickered to it. What's this? Open it. There was hesitation in her movements as she pulled out the contents. The moment she saw the first photograph, her breath caught. As she flipped through them, a shadow passed over her face. She wasn't surprised. Mark felt something crack inside him. You knew, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't deny it. Instead, she carefully set the pictures down and folded her hands in her lap. How long have you known? She asked softly. Not long, but long enough. He leaned forward. So, I'll ask again. How long have you known? Ellen exhaled slowly, looking down at her hands. Since the beginning. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He recoiled as if she had physically struck him. All this time, his voice rose, barely containing his fury. You knew Amanda was cheating on me? That Josh was sleeping with my wife? That my youngest son isn't even mine? His mother flinched but held his gaze. I didn't know about the child, Mark, she said firmly. Not at first. Mark shot up from his chair, pacing like a caged animal. That's supposed to make me feel better? He let out a bitter laugh. God, Mom, I trusted you more than anyone. And you knew. He turned to her, his eyes blazing. Why didn't you tell me? Ellen stood, her hands trembling as she reached for him, but he stepped back. I wanted to, she admitted, her voice laced with regret. I wanted to tell you 1,000 times, but you had just had a baby. You were happy, Mark. You adored that boy from the moment you held him. I couldn't bring myself to take that away from you. Mark's hands curled into fists at his sides. So you let me live a lie. She shook her head. I didn't let you, Mark. She sighed, rubbing her temple. I thought maybe it was a mistake. A one-time thing. I thought if Amanda stayed, if she was faithful after that, then maybe it didn't matter. Didn't matter? Mark slammed his fist against the wall, rattling a framed family photo. His father's face stared back at him, a man who had built a life on loyalty and integrity. Mark felt sick. You of all people should have known the truth always matters. Tears welled in his mother's eyes, but she didn't look away. I know, and I was wrong. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken wounds. Mark turned away, his breathing uneven. He felt like a fool. His entire life had been a carefully constructed illusion, and the one person who was supposed to protect him had helped keep the curtain drawn. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, he admitted, his voice hollow. Ellen nodded, her lips pressing together. I understand. Mark ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm inside him. He had come here for answers, but all he had found was another betrayal. He turned toward the door, his jaw tight. I need time. His mother wiped at her eyes and nodded. Take all the time you need. Mark didn't look back as he left. The night air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to cool the rage burning in his chest. His mother had chosen silence. Amanda had chosen lies. Josh had chosen betrayal. And now, it was Mark's turn to choose. And he chose revenge. Mark sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets, but inside him, a storm raged. The manila envelope in the passenger seat held the truth, the undeniable, scientific truth that would either confirm his worst fear or grant him an improbable reprieve. He had thought about this moment for weeks. The sleepless nights, the silent stares at Amanda, the way he studied his younger son's face, searching for any trace of himself. He had told himself that maybe, just maybe, there was an explanation. A fluke, an error, a medical anomaly. But deep down, he already knew the answer. The DNA test was just the final nail in the coffin of his marriage. Mark exhaled sharply, snatching the envelope and tearing it open with shaking hands. The letter inside was crisp, clinical, devoid of emotion. Probability of paternity, 0%. His breath hitched, his vision blurred. It was real. His younger son, the boy he had raised, kissed goodnight, carried on his shoulders, cheered for soccer games, was not his. A choked sound escaped him, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing prepared him for the raw, gut-wrenching pain of seeing it in black and white. His mind reeled back through the years, dissecting every memory. The way his son called him dad with such certainty. The bedtime stories. The birthdays. The first time he rode a bike, looking back at Mark with those bright, trusting eyes. It was all a lie. Or was it? The boy had never lied to him. He was innocent, unaware of the cruel reality that was now crashing down around them. The liar was Amanda, the betrayer, the woman who had led him believe, for nearly 2 decades, that he was a father to a child who wasn't his. Mark felt something dark and primal rise inside him, a fury so deep it made his hands tremble. He wanted to storm home, throw the paper in Amanda's face, and watch her crumble beneath the weight of her deception. He wanted to see fear in her eyes, to hear her beg for forgiveness she would never receive. But no, that would be too easy. He had been playing this game all wrong. Amanda had deceived him for years, manipulating him, keeping her secrets buried. If he wanted true justice, he had to be smarter, calculated, precise. Mark folded the letter neatly and tucked it back into the envelope. He didn't destroy it. No, this was his weapon now, and he would use it when the time was right. He started the engine, pulling away from the curb with a clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The truth was finally in his hands, and soon, Amanda's world would come crashing down. And when it did, Mark would be the one holding the match. Mark sat at the dining table, the wooden surface polished to a dull sheen, reflecting the dim light from the overhead fixture. Across from him, Amanda fidgeted, her manicured nails tapping against the rim of her coffee cup. She had no idea what was coming. His heart pounded against his ribs, his fingers gripping the edges of a thick envelope, the same kind that had first unraveled his life. Slowly, methodically, he placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "What's this?" Amanda asked, her voice casual but with an underlying note of apprehension. Mark didn't answer. He simply gestured for her to open it. Amanda hesitated before peeling back the flap. As she reached inside and pulled out the contents, her expression shifted. First confusion, then recognition, and finally a sickly shade of horror. The color drained from her face as she flipped through the old photographs. Her own face, her own body, entangled in another man's arms. Her fingers trembled. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. Mark leaned forward, his voice low and deadly. "Josh sent them to me." Amanda swallowed hard. "Mark, I don't," he interrupted. His voice was sharp, final. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not anymore." Amanda set the photos down, folding her arms around herself as if she could shield herself from the truth that had finally come to light. Mark reached into the envelope again, retrieving another set of papers. He spread them out like a deck of cards. A DNA test report, the official seal glaring up at her. She didn't need to read it. She knew. Mark's voice was eerily calm. "Our son, my son. Isn't mine, is he?" Amanda shook her head violently, tears welling in her eyes. "Mark, that's not. Tell me the truth, Amanda," he growled. "Was Josh his father?" A choked sob escaped her lips. She covered her mouth with both hands, squeezing her eyes shut as if she could block out the weight of her own guilt. "Yes," she finally whispered. "He is." Mark exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had known. He had known for days, for weeks. But hearing it from her mouth was something else entirely. "How long?" he asked. His voice had lost all warmth, all familiarity. He was no longer her husband. He was her judge, her executioner. Amanda hesitated. "How long?" She shuddered. 2 years. A bitter laugh escaped Mark's lips, short and sharp like the edge of a knife. 2 years. 2 goddamn years you were sneaking around with him. And what? You thought I'd never find out? You thought I'd just go on raising his kid like a fool?" Amanda reached for him, but he recoiled. "Mark, I loved you. I still love you. It was a mistake. Don't insult me," he snapped. "You don't accidentally screw another man for 2 years. You don't accidentally have his baby. You lied to me, Amanda. You let me believe he was mine." Tears streamed down her face. "I wanted to tell you I did, but I was scared." "You were scared?" Mark's voice cracked, his restraint slipping. "You should be, because everything we built, everything I thought we had, it was a lie." Amanda sobbed, shaking her head frantically. "Please don't do this. Don't throw us away." Mark stared at her, and for the first time, he felt nothing. Not love, not sadness, just a void where his heart used to be. "You threw us away," he said coldly. He stood up, looking down at her as if she were a stranger. "You destroyed this marriage, and now you'll face the consequences." He left her there, broken and weeping at the table, as he walked away toward the next phase of his plan. Mark sat across from Amanda at the polished oak conference table, his fingers interlocked, his jaw clenched. The high-rise office of Stein and Holloway law firm was sterile, almost unnervingly quiet, except for the ticking of an unseen clock. His lawyer, Eric, leaned back in his chair, tapping a fountain pen against his legal pad. Opposite them, Amanda sat with her attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Linda Kessler, notorious for securing favorable settlements for her female clients. Amanda's hands were folded in her lap, her nails neatly trimmed, painted in the same soft pink Mark remembered from their wedding day. But she was not the woman he had married. That woman, he now realized, had never truly existed. Kessler cleared her throat and slid a stack of documents across the table. "We propose a 50-50 division of assets, spousal support for 5 years, and joint custody of both children." Mark didn't even glance at the papers. He let the words hang in the air, tasting their audacity. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice cold and controlled. Amanda finally spoke. "Mark, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." Her voice was a practiced balance of calm and wounded. "We built this life together. You don't have to punish me like this." Mark's lips curled into a smirk. "Punish you?" He chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Amanda, you are the one who detonated our marriage. I'm just ensuring you don't walk away from the wreckage with a prize." Kessler cut in, her expression icy. "Mr. Holloway, the court will favor a fair division of marital assets. If we take this to trial, your financials will be scrutinized, and Amanda's role as the primary caregiver for your younger son will weigh heavily in custody decisions." Eric leaned forward, finally speaking. "Actually, Linda, I was about to suggest we do take this to trial." He slid an envelope across the table. Enclosed are copies of private investigator reports detailing Amanda's long-term extramarital affair with Joshua Ward, including timestamps and location data. There are also signed witness statements, including one from Katie Marshall, confirming that Amanda actively deceived Mark about the paternity of their second child. If we bring this before a judge, we will argue that Amanda engaged in marital fraud, which could drastically alter financial rulings. Kessler's confident smirk faltered. Amanda went pale. You investigated me?" Mark's eyes locked onto hers. "I had to. You weren't going to tell me the truth. Not 10 years ago. Not now." Amanda's breath hitched. "Mark, please." Eric held up a hand, silencing her. "Additionally, we have secured DNA evidence proving Mark is not the biological father of his younger son. While this is devastating, it also changes legal responsibilities." He glanced at Kessler. "Shall we continue?" Amanda's attorney hesitated, her fingers pressing into the table. "This is a family matter, and the court will not easily sever Mark's parental rights. He has acted as the father for nearly 18 years. Mark exhaled sharply through his nose. "Which means I've been financially responsible for another man's son under false pretenses. That's fraud. The law allows me to challenge child support obligations based on newly discovered paternity results." Amanda was trembling now. "Mark, don't do this. He's our son in every way that matters." Mark slammed his fist onto the table. "He's not mine." His voice echoed in the quiet room, and for a moment, no one spoke. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control. "I love him, but I won't be forced to support him when you rob me of the truth." Eric let the silence settle before delivering the final blow. "We propose the following. Mark retains full custody of the older son, and Amanda keeps custody of the younger one. Mark waives any legal responsibility for child support, given the fraudulent paternity. As for financial assets, we will not be agreeing to any spousal support. Amanda may keep her personal accounts, but Mark will not provide a dime beyond what the law strictly requires." Kessler's mouth opened, but Eric wasn't done. "If Amanda rejects this deal, we will take it to court and publicly expose every sordid detail. Her reputation will be destroyed. Her affair, the deception, the fact that she let another man raise her son under false pretenses, it will all be on record. And then, we'll see how lenient a judge feels when considering her character." Amanda's breath came in shallow bursts. Her once perfect posture had collapsed, shoulders sagging, fingers gripping the edge of the table as though it might keep her from falling apart. Mark leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You will sign these papers, Amanda. You will take your shame and your lies and leave with what little dignity you have left." Tears welled in her eyes. For a moment, she looked like the woman he had once loved, the woman he had trusted. But Mark reminded himself that she was an illusion, a mirage that had led him through years of false happiness. Amanda nodded shakily. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll sign." Kessler sighed, knowing there was no winning this battle. She reached for a pen, sliding it to her client. Amanda picked it up, hesitated for only a second, then scrawled her name on the divorce settlement. It was done. Mark rose from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket. "Goodbye, Amanda." He didn't look back as he walked out of the room, leaving behind the ashes of a marriage built on lies. For the first time in years, he felt free. Mark sat alone in his half-empty house, the echoes of a once happy family life haunting every corner. The divorce papers lay signed on the table, Amanda's name scrawled in ink beside his. It was done, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. He had always imagined betrayal as a violent thing, something that shattered instantly. But this was a slow, corrosive poison, eating away at everything he had ever believed. He wasn't just mourning the loss of a marriage. He was mourning the past, the love he thought was real, the faith he had in the people closest to him. The fallout had begun. News of Amanda's infidelity spread through their social circles like wildfire. It started with whispers at the country club, knowing glances at the grocery store. Mark didn't have to say much. People filled in the blanks themselves. He had strategically leaked just enough to let the story take on a life of its own. The real damage came when Amanda's family found out. Her mother, a woman obsessed with appearances, was horrified. "How could you do this to your family?" she had hissed over the phone. "You had everything, Amanda, and you threw it away for him." Josh wasn't just a man from Amanda's past. He was a disgrace, a drunk, a failure. He had been kicked out of the neighborhood years ago, leaving behind nothing but bad memories and unpaid debts. And Amanda had risked everything for him. It didn't take long for her to feel the weight of her mistakes. Her friends turned distant, their invitations drying up. Even at work, colleagues exchanged uneasy glances when she entered the room. That's her, the woman who cheated on her husband, the woman who lied for years. But the worst part? The moment she realized she had lost not just her marriage, but her son. Mark and Amanda's eldest, Ethan, had always looked up to his mother. But now, that admiration was gone, replaced by something sharp and bitter. "You disgust me," he told her the night he found out. His voice, usually so warm, was ice cold. "You didn't just cheat on Dad. You lied to me, to us, for years." Amanda tried to reach for him, but he stepped back as if her touch burned. Mark had never seen Ethan look at anyone with such pure loathing, not even at the school bullies he had fought growing up. And in that moment, Mark realized something else. Amanda wasn't just losing Ethan. She had already lost him. When the divorce settled, Ethan chose to live with Mark. It wasn't even a question. "I don't want to be around her," he said simply. And that was that. But Amanda wasn't the only one suffering the consequences. Katie, their longtime neighbor, the woman who had smiled at Mark every morning, pretending to be a friend, was now drowning in her own guilt. Mark made sure of it. The night of the confrontation, he had made a calculated move. He left an anonymous tip in a neighborhood group chat, hinting that Katie had played a role in covering up an affair that had broken a family. The reaction was swift. Mothers who had once trusted Katie to watch their children suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. Her name became synonymous with betrayal. One by one, friendships she had cultivated for years crumbled. When she finally called Mark, her voice was frantic. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she pleaded. "I was just trying to help Amanda." Mark's laugh was cold. "You knew what she was doing. You looked me in the eyes, again and again, and never said a word. That makes you just as guilty." Katie sobbed, but Mark felt nothing. For the first time in a decade, she was feeling what he had felt: loss, regret, isolation. And she deserved every second of it. But there was one person left. His youngest son. The child Mark had raised, loved, protected. The boy who bore his last name, but not his blood. Telling Ethan had been easy, but telling his younger son? The thought made Mark's stomach churn. The kid was innocent. He had no idea about the war raging around him. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching TV, his son glanced up at him. "Dad, why aren't you and Mom talking anymore?" Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "Sometimes people grow apart," he said carefully, "and sometimes people make choices that hurt others." His son frowned, thinking it over. "Will we still be a family?" Mark hesitated. The answer was complicated. "Yeah, buddy," he said finally, forcing a smile. "We'll always be family." Maybe one day, when he was older, Mark would tell him the truth. Or maybe not. Maybe he would let the boy believe that everything had been normal, that his father had always been his father. Either way, Mark knew one thing. Amanda would never get the chance to break his son's heart the way she had broken his. That night, as Mark lay in bed, he realized something. Revenge wasn't satisfying, not the way he had imagined. There was no grand moment of triumph, no cinematic conclusion where he felt truly victorious. But there was peace, and maybe that was enough. The courtroom was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the far wall. The air was thick with tension, a battlefield where only words and legal documents dictated the fate of a once happy family. Mark sat rigid, his fists clenched beneath the polished oak table. Across from him, Amanda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her lawyer whispering instructions in her ear. Mark had expected this moment to feel like a victory. He had gathered every piece of evidence, maneuvered every legal play, and watched as Amanda's carefully constructed life unraveled in public. And yet, as the judge prepared to make his final ruling, all he felt was exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of justice could lift. The court grants sole custody of Jonathan Carter to the petitioner, Mark Carter, the judge declared, his voice firm, final. Custody of Samuel Carter will remain with the respondent, Amanda Carter. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was done. Mark exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of the ruling. He had fought to keep both of his sons, but the law was cruel. It didn't care that one of them wasn't his by blood. He had been advised against contesting paternity. Doing so might have freed him from any financial responsibility, but it would have also severed any legal claim to Samuel. In the end, he couldn't bring himself to let go completely. The gavel struck wood, a sound of finality. Amanda looked at him then, her eyes wide, glistening with something unreadable. Was it regret, relief, or just the realization that she had lost the life they had built? Mark refused to return her gaze. He had seen enough lies in those eyes to last a lifetime. The house felt like a war zone. Cardboard boxes were stacked in corners, remnants of a life that was being carefully divided, stripped down to mere belongings. Mark stood in the hallway, watching as Amanda zipped up a suitcase filled with their younger son's clothes. Samuel sat on the couch, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, one that Mark had bought for him on his third birthday. He was only 18, but in that moment, he looked impossibly young, fragile. "You're not coming with us?" Samuel's voice was small, uncertain. Mark swallowed hard. "No, buddy. You're going to live with your mom." The words felt like swallowing glass. Samuel frowned. "But why? I thought we'd all still be together." Mark knelt down in front of him, forcing himself to smile despite the ache in his chest. "Things are going to be different now, but that doesn't mean I won't always be here for you." He hesitated, then added, "You can call me anytime, and you'll visit, okay? Whenever you want." It wasn't enough. It never would be. Amanda hovered near the doorway, watching. Mark could feel her waiting, itching to end this moment before it unraveled, before the truth slipped out. Because Samuel didn't know. He didn't know that Mark wasn't his real father. He didn't know that the man who had raised him, comforted him through nightmares, and taught him how to ride a bike was not the same man who had given him his blood. And Mark had decided he never would. What good would the truth do now? It wouldn't erase the birthdays, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories. It wouldn't undo the love that had shaped Samuel into the young man he was. Telling him would only leave him broken, lost between a father who had been a ghost and a father who had been a lie. So Mark swallowed his pride, his pain, and the injustice of it all. He chose silence. Amanda cleared her throat. "We should go." Samuel hesitated, then launched himself into Mark's arms. Mark held him tight, memorizing the way his son fit against him, the smell of his shampoo, the weight of him. He wanted to freeze time, to keep this moment before it faded into a memory. "Love you, Dad," Samuel murmured against his shoulder. Mark closed his eyes, his voice thick. "I love you too, kiddo." When they finally pulled apart, Amanda took Samuel's hand and led him to the car. Mark followed them to the door, but didn't step outside. He watched as his younger son climbed into the passenger seat, giving him one last hopeful glance, one that Mark could barely return. The engine rumbled to life. Tires crunched against gravel. And then they were gone. Mark stood in the doorway long after the car disappeared down the street, gripping the frame as though it was the only thing keeping him upright. The house was silent, empty. He had won his battle, but it didn't feel like a victory. The house stood empty. Mark leaned against the doorway, staring at the place where his family had once lived, where they had once been whole. The walls no longer echoed with laughter. The living room, once filled with holiday decorations and birthday balloons, was now just a hollow space with scuff marks on the floor where furniture used to be. It was amazing how quickly a home could turn into just a house. He stepped inside for the last time. The scent of old memories lingered. Amanda's vanilla-scented candles, the faintest trace of his son's cologne. He walked to the kitchen, tracing his fingers along the marble countertop, remembering the countless mornings they had spent here as a family. Amanda used to hum softly while making coffee. Their sons would rush in, grabbing toast before school. It had all felt so real back then. But it was an illusion. Mark glanced at the divorce papers in his hand. The settlement had gone in his favor, thanks to Eric and the damning evidence against Amanda. She had fought tooth and nail for more, but when the DNA results surfaced, proving that their younger son wasn't his, her leverage crumbled. The judge had ruled that Mark had no legal obligation to continue supporting the child financially. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. He had never wanted to hurt the boy. No matter the truth, he had raised him, loved him. Yet every time he looked at him now, he saw Josh's ghost staring back. His older son had chosen to stay with him, a decision that had shaken Amanda to the core. "You destroyed this family," his son had told her. "Dad didn't do this. You did." Amanda had cried, pleaded, but her tears no longer held power over Mark. He had wasted enough years believing in her, trusting her, loving her. A soft breeze drifted through the open window. It carried the sound of laughter from the neighbor's yard. Mark turned his head and caught a glimpse of Katie through the wooden fence. Their eyes met for a brief second. Once, she had been a friend. Now, she was just another liar who had smiled in his face while keeping Amanda's secrets. She quickly looked away, pretending to be occupied with something on her phone. Coward. Mark exhaled slowly and walked upstairs one last time. He stopped at the threshold of his younger son's room. The walls were still painted in the deep blue the boy had chosen years ago. A stack of books lay untouched on the desk, a few sports trophies collecting dust on a shelf. His heart clenched. He could have told the boy the truth. He could have shattered his world the way Amanda had shattered his. But what would that have accomplished? Some truths were better left buried. He closed the door and moved to his own bedroom, their bedroom. The bed where he had once held Amanda, whispered dreams about their future, made love to a woman he thought was his soulmate. Now it was just a reminder of betrayal. He had already taken what little he wanted from the room, his clothes, a few personal items. Everything else, the bed, the furniture, the memories, belonged to the past. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. It was cold between his fingers, a symbol that had once meant everything. Now it was nothing more than a band of metal, a relic of a lie. Without hesitation, he placed it on the nightstand and walked out, leaving it behind like a discarded promise. By the time he stepped outside, the sky had shifted to a soft orange glow. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. He locked the door, feeling an odd sense of finality as he turned the key. Eric was waiting by the car. "You ready?" Mark nodded. They drove in silence for a few minutes before Eric spoke again. "You did the right thing, getting out of this." Mark let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, doesn't feel like it." "It will," Eric said. "One day it will." Mark stared out the window as the house faded into the distance. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He was finally free. Free of the lies. Free of Amanda. Free to start over. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt alive.